The mic, I can talk. I don't know whether I can talk out of the mic, but I suppose if I move my head all the way over here, this is out of the mic, and then this is in the mic. So yeah,
it's a good way to describe it. Glad we got that clarified.
Just in case. No pun intended.
Because my name is Justin.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're feeling a little stiff this morning.
I am, yeah.
Yeah, you got
a slip in the
you got a
C9 disc or something.
Yeah? Looks like you're doing a shoulder twerk over there or something, you're trying to work it out.
I was like, how do you stretch that one
you need
vertebrae?
You need those cross over the arms and pick yourself up by your elbows
there you
move.
go.
That would
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Stop making me think about it. How are you, Mark?
I am well.
No vertebrates bothering you this morning? That's good.
I didn't get my stretching out done this morning, but typically I get my stretches.
You didn't?
I did not.
Oh,
yeah.
That's because I gave you homework.
Yeah, you gave me homework and I was prepping. I didn't get my stretches in this morning.
My bad.
That's okay. I am good.
Did you have your quiet time kombucha?
I did. I had my quiet time. Good. Like I say, that was 3:30. So like I say, had to make time for the prep. So but I was up. I was ready to go. So yeah, a little quiet time kombucha. The dogs just kind of laid at my feet and said, "Hey, this is a little early. We're glad to eat, but now we're just gonna lay down and finish the rest of our sleeping." So
that's nuts.
But it's good. It's good. If I would have done it at 9:30 last night when I received the text, it wouldn't have been any.
Right.
Yeah, it would have been non-beneficial.
Yeah, I hear that.
Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations.
So yeah, but it's good. It's good to see you.
Speaking of quiet time kombucha, you got me on it.
Yeah, how's that going?
Well, I think it's going all right.
Yeah? You got a kombucha, you got a SCOBY growing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Then you're good.
It's doing its thing. It's a little bit hard to keep it at the temperature they're saying, 74 to 80 or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it just got cool out, so.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I understand.
Got this little heater mat that is like a foot heater, basically, mat. So I got it on that. And
is that working?
It's working.
Good.
It kicks off on its own.
Oh, okay. So it can regulate it at a temperature.
Yeah. Well, no, it doesn't ever come back on.
Oh, it doesn't cycle on and
right,
off. Okay. Yeah.
So it's kind of one of those, anyway.
Yeah.
It's a new learning thing, trying to figure it out, but it's good.
Well, good for you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the reward.
It's what we desire to offer is new learning.
That's right.
Oh, and speaking of new learning, I made a mistake the other day. Well, probably more than one. But in the podcast, I was Chris brought to my attention, I was using the term whole milk in place of raw milk.
Oh.
So for anybody, that was confused by that, basically whole milk just means all of the fat is in it. It's typically 4%. But raw milk is non-pasteurized.
Right.
So all of the bacteria and the enzymes that I believe are designed in it are available to our digestive system. And when we pasteurize it, we take out some of the good bugs with the what is not good, term not good bugs, it's like the balance is gone at that point. So like say, that was my bad because I was using whole milk in place of raw milk in the podcast.
And there was what we were talking about. You were saying that you were saying whole milk, but raw milk has a certain benefit or what were you
raw milk has because we're talking about so much lactose intolerance today in our food chain and that kind of thing, and what happens is many of the enzymes that are in raw milk are killed in the pasteurization process. So many people who would consider themselves lactose intolerant can actually drink raw milk without the side effects.
That's right. Yep.
Of milk and that kind of, because the digestion of the fat particles and so forth. So yeah, that was a bad move on my part, but like I say,
that's all right. Should we talk about pasteurization?
Not this morning, but yeah,
I guess apparently that can be a polarizing topic.
We're going to find out. That's my whole goal, is to find out.
That's right.
Yeah.
But that's actually not what we're going to talk about this morning, right?
No, it's not.
That's not what you got up to do your homework for.
That's not. But I did appreciate the opportunity to do the homework. It was fun.
Yeah.
It was fun.
It's an interesting topic. So
yeah,
it's about hypnotism. We're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And depending on who you are, what you've heard about it, or whatever, it might be you might be on a polar side of whether you think it's voodoo and evil, or you think it's a viable thing, or whatever, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. I first heard a podcast on Huberman Labs, which I really like that podcast. He talks a lot about kind of some cutting edge science and stuff like that. And I think we referenced him before. I think like when we talk about
neuroplasticity and neuropathways. Yep.
And so this is, kind of falls in a similar groove in terms of changing your brain.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good podcast. Generally, I feel like it's a solid one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I listened to one where he talked about hypnotism with a doctor that's been his focus his whole life, and in fact, his father was also, that was his primary focus. It was kind of cool. Dr. Spiegel,
psychoanalyst. Basically, with the combination of hypnotism in that process. So yeah. Even that psychoanalyst can have kind of its own connotation. You kind of can go to the Freudian side of things, and you think from a therapy standpoint, so it's just interesting to think about, as the two come together. For me personally, is because I think, we can have all of our different views. And I think that's a good part of the hypnotism, is basically, we tend to look at things on a continuum, and one side somebody that looks at, cognitive behavioral therapy or something, CBT versus, psychoanalysis type stuff, it's gonna have a differing viewpoint to certain people based on that aspect of vulnerability and control and those kind of things that tend to create polarizing topics. So
I think you're speaking from like we're all in on this and understand what you're saying. So I'm going to tease it out a little bit, but explain to me, because it sounds like you're saying CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is one end of potentially some sort of continuum, where psychoanalysis maybe, is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
it might be on the other.
In other words, when we think of psychoanalysis, we tend to think of Freudian and all of his, if you will, his flawed research based on, over focusing on sexualization, that kind of thing, that I believe what he found, in many cases, these complexes, if you will, I think some of that is real in our human experience, but the foundation that it's all about being a sexual being isn't necessarily, original. And that's not to give psychoanalysis a bad rap in that process. It's just that individual.
And it's also probably, correct me if I'm wrong, fair to say that that's just one focus of psychoanalysis.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some other focuses?
When you think of like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, we're basically, focusing on how I think, in that process of being able to recognize, well, quite often, like you and I will talk about, the always and the nevers.
Yeah.
That process of the flexibility of my thinking tends to help me recognize whether I have the ability to be fluid in a changing environment, or whether I'm going to maintain
you're tied to your script.
Yeah. An unhealthy rigidity, if you will. I think, rigidity can be mislabeled as well. I think, there's something to be said for, I think we need to have some flexibility in life. And we've talked about that with open-mindedness, and hypnosis for me is a similar dynamic. Granted, for me personally, I see it as another gateway, if you will, to, the mind. For me, I do see it as very similar. I have, clients who have experienced ketamine, ketamine therapy, hyperbaric chambers, where you're floating in salt water, and you're kind of given this weightlessness, and and even some, and much of these processes,
and that's like a sensory deprivation type process. It's
creating what I would call a mindfulness. Not so much, even the ketamine experience goes through a mindfulness process, where you're listening to certain songs, you're focusing on things, and I think that's so much of what, for me, hypnosis can be, is this ability to shift states of mind, or, and it's a guided, focused process. I'm not saying that can't have adverse, dynamics. And, that being said, I really like the way they developed, clinical, hypnosis apart from stage hypnosis.
Yeah. So I was going to mention that in the podcast episode. They kind of delineated between those two, right?
Sure.
And this idea that stage hypnosis is kind of the version of, hypnosis that we all think of, or,
where somebody's clucking like a chicken and going across the stage, kind of embarrassing themselves.
Dangling the watch. And then you see the little... the circle thing.
And for me, and here again, I appreciate, I think this is kind of where I come from. I appreciate solid research.
Yeah. Because
I don't think we have anything to be scared of.
Yeah.
When we have solid research. The research that frustrates me, is when we're basically doing research, but we're just ignoring all these other things to kind of promote the idea. I would say even the vaccines, were a part of that. We need to have this out, and we need to create this safety, so we're going to push this stuff through. And we weren't necessarily given credibility to some of these alternative issues that might be, I'm not saying they are, but we can see there's some correlation between this. So like you say, I'm all in favor of solid research. And like you say, Huberman Labs, I seem to, I appreciate what he's able to share in the context of the questions and that kind of thing. I think, it's solid stuff from my perspective.
Yeah. I mean, from the two or whatever.
It's like, I'm certainly not going to argue with what those guys are saying. They use more what are those labels, like
the buzzwords,
CNPR, JPDD, and it's like, and they know what all that stands for, and it's like, if they say it out, it's like, okay, I might know one part of that, and that sounds like singlet and all that stuff,
Andrew Huberman is a professor at NYU or something. I don't remember.
Stanford, isn't he?
Sir, Stanford. Anyway, the point is he's a smart guy. And then he has on these world-renowned scientists to talk about stuff. It's pretty cool. But anyway, one of the reasons I wanted to chat about it here is just because of maybe more of the theological side of it. And in fact, there was a message at our church maybe 6 months ago or something, and our pastor was just making the point about do whatever you need to do to get healthy from certain addictions. He said, if I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something about do anything, do counseling or hypnotizing or whatever you need to do. And I think maybe it was a little tongue-in-cheek. I don't really know, but someone asked me about that. Like, what do you think about that? Yeah, like, what is that? That doesn't seem right. Why would that be said from the pulpit kind of thing? And I was
what do you do in circumstances like that?
When
people are asking you, because I think I run into that myself.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of, it's like, at what point you're able to express, I'm not trying to shift the subject, but
no,
because I think in our day and age and it's like people can't necessarily approach the pastor every time in every circumstance with, 1,300 people in attendance,
Yeah.
And so other people, I find myself in that situation where it's like, what do you think about that?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's an honest question.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, like you say, I might not always find myself in agreement, but.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about it like what you just shared about the milk, right?
Okay.
Like, out of all the podcast episodes, 85 to be exact, have been released. Like, there's a good chance there's a lot of stuff in there that isn't quite accurate, right? Like,
okay.
But our goal isn't necessarily to be 100% accurate. In fact, we called it How I See It so that we don't have to be accurate.
That's our disclaimer. Our title is our disclaimer.
That's right. Exactly. It's right in there. Joking aside, like, we do our best, but make mistakes, word slips, whatever you want to say, and I remember the one that I keep bringing up about talking about homeschoolers and whatever that emotional, what was it?
Intelligence.
Yeah. Like how I've been, eating those words ever since and that kind of thing. But that's like a perfect example of something that, came out one way and didn't necessarily mean. And that's one perspective I'll often grant is like, well, I mean, we can't expect our pastor to be batting 1,000. He's not going to never say something wrong or slip or whatever.
Sure.
And so that's kind of number one, right?
Exactly.
And then beyond that, it's about the specific thing. So in this case, I was like, well, I totally get his point, and I agree with this point, which is like, do what you have to do. Like, think like that. Like, for me, being involved in CR for a long time, it's not until someone says, I'll do whatever it takes, that they're willing to do whatever it takes. You know what I mean? And, and I think that was kind of his point, is about being willing to do whatever it takes. As to that exact thing about hypnotism, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, and I had actually just listened to this episode, not too much long before that. I heard the same message. I didn't remember hearing that point. So to me, it didn't stand out as like... mind-blowing or whatever, but I imagine for someone who has, maybe heard about or read about or, has a particular bent theologically that it's wrong for many, for whatever reason, that would be like, doing, it'd stand right out in the message. So I understand that. And this person sent me a link to gotquestions.org, which generally I really respect that website. It's really cool about tackling, I mean, it's kind of like what we try and do, tackling hard questions, polarizing questions from a biblical perspective. And so they're, asking about hypnosis, and they have their answer, and it's very much hypnosis is wrong for, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons.
Yep.
All of which are good reasons. I think it's a solid argument. I came away from reading it. I mean, you briefly mentioned something about opening our mind to influence, right?
Sure. Gateways.
Yes, gateways. Yeah, sure. It's good. And I was thinking about some of those points sound exactly. If you didn't know they were talking about hypnotism, you could think about them talking about, like catfishing. Right? Or someone who's in the influence of somebody they shouldn't be, and how influential that can be, and how they can basically change their brain to say, weird, creepy people like us are trustworthy and everyone else is not, and kind of some of that stuff that can happen, right? And it made me think about how, and of course that author of that article wouldn't argue that those are good situations either. I guess I was just saying, like, the way they described it didn't sound that different from other ways to be influenced, that if you are not entering it with a wise mind and the desire, in healthy desires, it can be really problematic.
Sure. And I think even as I, it's funny because you bring that up. It's like, even as I was talking about research and, and smart people, the whole, and it's definitely the beginning of Romans. Maybe it's not Romans 1, but, where it talks about, they gave themselves over basically to intelligence, these knowledgeable people, and they still did, to a depraved mind, if you will. You follow me? And I'm not at that point where I'm saying, all science is all good, all research is all good, but I think we do have to be mindful or be aware that there are many things about our body, about our mind-body connection that we are really unaware of, or have been unaware of. And so much, research is being done in such a way that there is a greater awareness. And I'd still say some of these things, like mindfulness, if you want to take it, from a Eastern mysticism type perspective, where, I am emptying myself, right, and that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm not for that, but the process of mindfulness in being focused, and even, I would even dare say, some of what I do in a devotional, Christ-centered devotion is part of mindfulness. Yes. My ability to get up at a certain time and have certain routines and certain structures, I believe that's mindfulness for me. I feel like that's a good parallel, right? This idea. So meditation, right? It can go two directions. It can go to that Eastern meditation and empty your brain, that kind of thing. And it can go, that's the term we often use in Christian circles to talk about, quiet time or whatever. It's kind of meditation or whatever. Sure. And the difference being, trying to empty your brain versus trying to focus your brain. Yes. And I feel like that is a good correlation to this concept of hypnosis where, kind of this stage of hypnosis is trying to reset your brain state so that I can get you to do something I want you to do. Yep. Where clinical hypnosis is this idea to, first you start with focus, right? And it's kind of similar to what you were saying about the ketamine therapy, where they kind of set up, right? Well, in ketamine therapy, you're actually given the drug, which creates a gateway. Yeah. That kind of thing. But yes. Yeah, and this is essentially that, but without the drug, right? Exactly. But it's basically, you're trying, but you were describing a setting up of an environment. Yep. To initiate a certain specific change. It's therapy. It's this attempt to reframe your thinking about a particular thing. Usually it's trauma, right? Like, or maybe phobias. A strong addiction or phobias. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And this is very much in that vein, according to what I understand from this. Where there's this setup, there's this focusing of your efforts towards this one thing. Yes. And then that brain state, you get into the state where you're able to rethink things. And I thought that was pretty cool. But again, that correlation seemed to tie pretty well together, this idea of meditating for the sake of emptying your brain or meditating for the sake of focusing it. Yes. Similar, I think, in the hypnosis thing. Like if your attempt is just to empty your brain, or I don't know. And I'll be honest, in the got questions perspective, it's not that I disagreed with anything of that, but it definitely, and I think it brings up that context of hypnosable versus non-hypnosable. Yeah. Hypnosable people will be able to have this connection of, if I may say so without using the brain parts, that there isn't this conflict, this inner brain conflict, and that allows them to be hypnosed. Yeah. To the point of being, brought into this state where I'm open to this gateway, and then there's an influence that's provided there. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Well, it's cool. Yeah, that's he talked pretty much at length about hypnotizability, which is which you're talking about, and this idea that there's a
a wide swath of,
Yep.
you know, people and how hypnotizable they are. And
Yep.
some are very, you know, hypnotizable, and some are not. And
Sure.
he said that just has a lot to do with kind of your brain makeup and how you think about things. Kind of what you're saying.
The conflict.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The conflict, whether you can disassociate, you know, competing ideas, you know, or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, but yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. I think, I'd be curious to know, essentially, I feel like a lot of times trauma can reframe our brain to think a certain way, right? Like it's kind of a forcing of neural pathways to be inserted into our brain. That's an unhealthy pattern, but it's due to this kind of sheer force of the brain through trauma, right?
Experience.
Yeah.
I like to think of it, and this is how I think of it. I tend to think of, you know, our brain, we have these neural pathways. Okay. And they're very similar to what I used to call a crick, but it's actually a creek. You know, these smaller pathways. Okay. Well, when we experience trauma, okay, it's like a huge flood comes through. And now all those little individual creeks,
tributaries
that, you know, just kind of meandered. Now there's this cutting force that has gone through and in many cases rewired those neural pathways.
Yeah.
So instead of having these individual, you know, tributaries that can kind of filter, you know, certain things out, you know, now we have this big river that's gone through, and now it makes it seem as if everything is connected to that one thing.
Yeah.
Because we don't have these little parts that can kind of filter out where, well, we went this way. We used to go this way, then that way. You know, now it's all one pathway.
Yeah.
That's
fascinating. Yeah.
That's the analogy that I would typically use.
I like that analogy a lot. Yeah.
So
yeah. And the goal of a lot of therapy is to add nuance back in so that you can, and that's, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy is about like, let's think through this thing and think about, right? Let's process this river and start to tease out these tributaries a little bit to see if we can say, well, is this thing always in that same river?
Exactly.
No, sometimes it's not. So you can start to separate these strands back out. Theoretically over. And that was one of the things they said in this episode too, like that's effective in that cognitive, you know, therapy of that sort. They said hypnotism is just a lot faster. It's essentially the same process, just a lot faster, which I thought was interesting. But it's this idea that you can get someone into a state where they're more able to accept the suggestions, right? The influence, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if the goal,
go ahead, sorry.
If the goal of that influence is to, you know, address to the specific trauma or whatever, it can be really, you know, according to them and according to how hypnotizable you are, it can be very effective in terms of just getting right to the root of the issue, teasing it out, working it out, doing it in a safe way.
Sure.
One of the things they mentioned is that when they prep you for it, they give you all the tools to be in control of it, so you can turn it on, you can turn it off, and then essentially their goal is to make it something reproducible. So whenever you need to, like, you know, reframe your brain again because you feel like it's starting to go back to that river state, you can enter that state of hypnotism, you know, whatever hypnotism, to be able to kind of go through these, you know, the process of whatever it is. And anyway, I thought that was interesting. Essentially, they're saying like it's a way to kind of quickly, I guess maybe short circuit the thing, the normal process. Yeah,
sure.
Which anytime you hear a shortcut, you know, that can be a you should be wary of shortcuts for many reasons.
Sure,
know? But
yeah,
your thoughts?
You know, that's what, and I think, you know, even the word therapy for years in general, you know, it's like. No. And I think what makes that difference is my viewpoint. And granted, you know, I shifted. I'm not saying, you know, I mean, I remember, you know, seeing people staged in my personal life, you know, on a, you know, from a hypnotic standpoint. You know, I've experienced that, seen that, you know, and it's like, I do feel they talked about it in the podcast too. I think that's irresponsible. In some ways to use that, and I think.
Can you explain that? You experienced what now?
In other words, I've seen hypnotists, hired hypnotists come into a. Oh yeah.
You've been present for the experience.
Yeah, I've been present for the experience.
Tell me more, Mark.
Well, it's like I said, it's like you can take a grown, 50-year-old respectable individual and turn them into a laughing stock because every time, you say a word, they'll cluck like a chicken.
Was that the purpose? Like, what was the event that the
It was like a conference.
Okay. As part of
like a comedian
or training
or it was like the evening entertainment or like your 2:00 break or whatever, when everybody's falling asleep.
Okay, yeah.
You bring in the keynote, you bring in the entertainment, if you will.
Okay.
I believe it was actually like evening entertainment, like the gala or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, they take individuals, of course, that, were actually, managers or higher up people and put them on this stage and, make them look like laughing stocks, which, of course, from a group mentality, it's like, we're all for this, put it to the man type stuff. But it wasn't in the podcast, that they brought up, sometimes, in this process of staging and entertainment, of course, we're putting people in this state, but we're not always mindful of bringing them out. And I thought, that's, I'll be honest, there was a lot of parallels in my perspective with what I do, and how being responsible for people's time, taking them into a state, because I believe therapy and hypnosis and other things does come back to the responsibility of the person to put safeguards in place. It has to be safe.
Yes.
Because if it's not safe, nothing's going to change, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about time and responsible for essentially the session, because I think what you're getting at is this idea that you could work them all up and get them all riled up right to the end of the session, and that's what they're leaving. So their brain has been, their state has been changed to be in this very irritable state and unwilling to, maybe just be confront, whatever, kind of leaving in a not great state. And so you see it as your responsibility to kind of bring them into a place and then bring them back to It makes a lot of sense, which also makes a lot of sense, as far as what they're saying about short-circuiting some of that process to be able, okay, let's get right back to, the work and then get right back out of it,
And I think
it's interesting.
And I think that's where, they mentioned, you mentioned it as far as, we all have different schemas, as far as what one word may mean to you is far different than what it may. Money, for example. What does that mean when I say the word money alone? What does that say to you, versus what it means to me? And likely we're going to view that very differently. Well, they mentioned the one lady who had been part of a stage dynamic, and she was supposed to hold a little bird. And she saw herself as a trophy wife who was the bird in the gilded cage, and and that state was never recognized, and she wasn't transitioned out, and that's irresponsible in my part, to be able to take someone to that state and then not be able to reprocess that state in such a way that says, okay, we're coming back, because I believe that's a lot of what therapy is, from my perspective, is this exposure.
Yes.
I'm not an exposure therapist, but we're able to talk about things. It has to be a safe environment for me to go into this mental state of feeling safe enough to talk about that traumatic experience. And I think what hypnotism does, in this clinical sense of hypnotism, is it is able to get me into that state quicker. And I think there again, I think we have not multiple, but I think we have more gateways, as I refer to them, than just, the cognitive behavioral thinking pathway. I think there is a mindfulness type dynamic, and I also, like EMDR and these other and chemically induced, gateways. It's funny because, I go clear back, not clear back. But just in the research, and this is what makes it interesting, is I believe this is how complex we are, that some things work for some people that won't work for other people. Yeah. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
And, I'm not sure I've mentioned it in here on the podcast, but there's a great book, Vander Kolk is his last name, Norwegian sounding kind of guy, but The Body Keeps the Score. And he's probably done the most research compared to, or at least written so much on the whole trauma experience. And, he goes through this process, and this is kind of what connects it to hypnosis for me. He goes through and at the end of this book, he goes through all of the different dynamics that have been used to treat trauma, because there just really isn't one cookie cutter size thing to be able to deal with trauma. And yes, yoga works for some people. Mindfulness works for talk therapy works for some people, but ultimately, I think at the basis of all of it is this ability to recognize that I'm not just I'm not just a body full of triggers.
Yes.
You follow me? Yeah. I don't have to react. You're not a puppet. Exactly. I don't have to react to everything. Mm-hmm. And I'm able to learn, and I would say this even from a scriptural standpoint, there would be, I suppose you could shift it. Like most things, you can shift them into a non-scriptural perspective or a non-biblical perspective. But from my perspective, I don't have an issue. One of the fruits of the Spirit, self-control. You follow me? In that dynamic, I'm learning that when I experience that, and that we see that with phobias. Phobias would be a good example. I see a snake. Well, is it healthy for me to have a reaction to a snake? Yes, probably so. Mm-hmm. But now, and if I've been bitten by a dog, I'm going to, but is that to say all dogs are mean and nasty, and they're going to bite me in the face? No. So, that ability that I have, and I think that's where, as they were talking about the clinical hypnosis, it's able to take me to that point where I'm shifting my thoughts about that conflict, that the dog represents pain and, hospitalization for me. Yeah. All dogs represent that. Mm-hmm. That creates a conflict. And then being able to kind of have that exposure that says, okay, is every experience been this way? And how would you interact? Is this the way you interact with everything that has hurt you? Mm-hmm. That it's like, no. Mm-hmm. I've been hurt by other people, or, I've been hurt by, sticks, but I still, stones and, know.
Yeah. And this idea, I really like kind of what they're saying. They chat a little bit at one point about how, we try to avoid pain and we try to avoid any kind of, stress.
Sure.
Right. And they're saying, well, stress is part of life and we have to learn how to deal with strife, not avoid it, because you just can't. You can't avoid stress. So the more work you do at canceling everybody and creating a clean room of stress or whatever, the more stressed you'll be. Like the more,
exactly,
that every little thing will be that much more stressful.
Yep.
And so they use the term they reference the term called stress inoculation. Yep. Which is done in some studies with some chimps. This idea of taking them away from their mother for a bit of time, a little bit a day, would actually make them 2 hours a day. It would actually make them more resilient to stressors
in the future.
Yep. Which
stress tolerance is basically.
Yeah. But I like what they're saying. They're basically saying if you want to heal trauma, there's no way to heal it without going to it.
Yeah.
Without, going back to that stressor and re-examining it. And that's kind of the point of what you're saying, kind of the point of what they're saying is like, no matter what, that's what you got to do.
Sure.
Now, some people can do it through ketamine therapy. Some people, even you've heard of psilocybin, mushrooms, that kind of thing. Like that's I read this article about vets who come back and are, PTSD, depression, anger episodes, that kind of thing. And there's a clinic, I think in Mexico or something. Obviously, it's kind of this shady thing, right?
Yep, crossing the border.
Yeah, exactly, because it's not legal here. At least in the way they were doing it, where they would go and they would do this psilocybin therapy, and come back and be able to live a normal life, that kind of thing. There's that. There's hypnosis again, but the goal of all of these things, if done in a therapeutic, session, is this attempt to take you right back to that trauma and start to peel apart these tributaries again, right? So you're in the room. What was it like? And describing the situation. But if you're in this, the whole thing with, again, what I understand about hypnosis is, all right, we're going to do this thing. Here's how you're in control. Like you're going to look at it, you're going to enter the state, and you're going to look at the screen on your left. The screen on your left is going to be the trauma situation. The screen on your right is going to be some buttons that you can control it, And so when when you reach a state where you're not comfortable, you just hit this button to stop, and then we'll pop back out and we'll be in a safe place or whatever. And just the ability to project in your mind onto screens.
Sure.
Just the ability to say, it's not a real thing, it's this thing that's replaying in front of me that I can control.
Sure.
Allows you to go back into that memory and kind of rewind, fast forward, pause, and work through that and say, now when this happened, what was the situation? And they use this one example of this lady who had been assaulted, and she kind of came away from it as she zoomed into the situation and kind of relived it, going, wow, it could have been way worse. Like, he could have murdered me. And, the takeaway was, what did you find about that? I think actually he didn't expect me to fight. Like, I think I was stronger than he thought I was. And I ended up being able to get out of that situation. And so the result of this therapy was to go back and go, you're not as vulnerable as it made you feel. Like, you were actually very strong in that situation and managed to escape or whatever it was. And that allowed her to start reframing some of those insecurities to say, I'm pretty strong. And, I don't know. It's kind of an interesting situation that they set up. But I like this idea of creating this safe construct to then go into the thing.
Sure.
Because from my understanding and from our conversation, just, there's no other way to deal with trauma but to deal with it. Like, to go to it and work through it, tease it apart. Is that...
No, it's interesting because I think, and I'm talking at times, as we're talking, I'm thinking, I use the terminology gateways and so on and so forth. But, I would dare say, sex and sexuality, or basically our God-given design to be able to have sex is another gateway of influence, if you will. And I think, so often it is when it's used out of context that, it becomes damaging.
Yeah.
But in God's design for it, it's very, comforting. It's very, it builds relationship, bonding. Yes. Yeah. There's a design for it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, that's what, in that process. And when we even think of the word charisma, or someone who's charismatic, we can think of, Jim Jones or somebody like that or Dave Koresh who, led many people away, and, to in an occult type dynamic, because I think that would be one thing that most cult leaders would have, but you can take someone else who like Jimmy Evans or somebody who just has a passion for marriage or somebody like that and leads multiple people in in a godly, biblical direction, doesn't have to maintain that following for a false sense of pride, but yet they have a following. People have a following. Olstein, he has a following, and I think, so we have to be careful from my perspective about saying, oh, that's of the occult, charisma. That's all, people who are charismatic just lead people astray. Not always, we all know. And your mentor was a very charismatic, as you described Keith in that process, someone who could lead people. Granted, maybe he didn't deal with his own pride issues of self, but yet it's not that what he didn't have an impact for the kingdom either.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I come from kind of with this, it's the brick or it's the money thing. We want to shift quickly to, money's the root of all evil. Well, no, the love of money is the root of all evil, and a brick can be used to be pitched through a window, but yet it can also build, up schools and educational facilities, that kind of thing. That's how I see so much of what, part of what God has given us in these different gateways to be able to shift that influence in some ways. Yeah. And here again, I'm just thinking of it as I was going through that. It's not about me in this process, but I would dare say I have my, mindfulness practices. Like the one that came to mind for me is there's no secret. I'll take naps sometimes, in my office in the process of a day if I have a break or something. And it's like, I've been able to go to sleep, 3 times in 7 minutes before, just because I can go to sleep that quickly. And, a dream might wake me up or something. But part of my routine is I'll have a routine. I lay down in a certain way. And then I start counting, and that just basically gives me a single-minded focus. I'm not saying, well, I got this client. What if my alarm doesn't go off? What if this, what? All I'm doing is counting. And by the time I'm to 10, I'm typically asleep, because I'm not in that divided.
Very similar to hypnosis, right?
In a lot of cases, yes. And like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Whew.
Oh. Nice job.
Yeah, well, like you say, I sometimes get restructuring, but it's reprocessing. And basically, that's another gateway, if you will. And they mentioned it in there, but I think it's basically my ability to move my eyes back and forth in such a way. And, it was noticed by a lady who was walking through a park, as the founder of that process. And, it's like, and we have these abilities sometimes, when we tend to look up to the left, it kind of signifies part of our design. There's a purpose for that. There's like a conscious, I'm tapping into my self-conscious when I'm looking up either to the right or to the left. I don't have that part down. I'll be honest with you, but our eyes do certain things, when we're processing, and it's so that's another, if I may say, I'm using the term loosely a little bit this morning, but another gateway that we have to be able to be open to these processes of influence and being able to minimize pain. There was that lady recognized that, as she moved her eyes in a specific way, and it had, as I'm recalling a little more, it had something to do with the way the light was coming through the trees. So if you think about it, some people, especially seizures, people who are given to seizures, a strobing effect can bring on seizures for people. Yeah. You follow me? Yep. And that's what it was for her. It was like a sunset and she passing through trees in this process. And she recognized she was moving her eyes in a certain way. And she suddenly recognized that what was once a painful thought or memory had lost its significance. So, it's like, and from my perspective, that's not that's not seancing, that's not transcendental meditation. I mean, it's just, that was an experience, and it created an awareness, and she looked to develop that in a way that helped other people find that relief from those painful memories as well.
Yeah.
And so granted, yeah.
And, the brick analogy is great, right? Every tool can be used to hurt or to harm or to help. And,
tear down, build up.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about this particular podcast episode was hearing this Dr. Spiegel kind of talk about how his life's work has been about trying to figure out the best way to help people. And he said, this seems to be the best way. And I really enjoy seeing this tool be used to help people. And, so that kind of helped reframe the brick a little bit for me, right? To kind of hear that perspective and, that tool can be used in that way, and it's been effective in helping to build the house, right? Yep. Like, I think we're definitely we'll link to these different resources.
Oh, sure. Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, the podcast episode, and I would encourage any of you, listeners, like, read this stuff, listen to this stuff, make your own, kind of decisions and thoughts on it. But it was very interesting to me to think about this, and all of this stuff really is you mentioned gateway, right? Like, any gateway to me is fascinating.
I gotcha.
Right? This idea where you're telling me I can get kind of like short circuit this process to get to this brain change. And the thing is, I know brain change is possible, and I know that there are long pathways to get to that.
Sure.
And that's Celebrate Recovery. If you're involved in a program like that for years and years, your brain will change for the better. When you're or if you have a good quality group of friends and you meet regularly, or you have a mastermind. You've heard that term, like a business mastermind, where you meet with other people in a similar business set.
Sure.
And it's all at this goal to hold each other accountable, to learn and grow from each other.
Yep.
Anything like that is this attempt to, reframe your brain pathways to be more effective.
We can even look at that as the early church model. Coming together, small groups coming together, with a positive word, a word of encouragement, a word from the, or a song, that kind of thing.
It's church in general, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the hope, and as I was thinking about, as you were mentioning CR, from my perspective, CR is a more complex dynamic. You follow me? Because you have the 12 steps, you have this gathering.
Structural type.
That offer people tools to be able to implement in such a way on a complex dynamic, whether it's hurts, habits, or hangups. But I think about it so often, and I tend to think about things somewhat in a fundamental way. And the breathing was another one that came to mind, because
breathing exercise.
For me, that's a fundamental, to where when because that's a God-given, automatic nervous system type thing, to be able to say, once that I'm floating down that river again, and I'm feeling all these things from a somatic, my body is feeling these things at a certain level, and it's like I can still engage my prefrontal cortex in such a way that says, okay, I'm feeling this, but it doesn't have to be the same as it was. And I can start, that diaphragmatic breathing that takes back the control of my body, from my prefrontal cortex,
your
primary function. I'm bypassing my flight or fight mechanisms in such a way that I'm re-engaging my body. I'm able to take that because, like you say, my primary function is strong because it's designed to keep me alive, but it's not real smart.
Right.
So fireworks and gunfire are very similar.
Yeah.
So I have to engage my prefrontal cortex to be able to decipher that difference.
To tease them out. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when I'm able to breathe, I'm able to keep that function online that says, okay, this is 4th of July. This isn't Afghanistan again.
Yeah.
You follow me?
Yep.
And I think that's part of that hypnosis, when I can go to that state, and I think it, like you're saying, it bypasses in such a way that I can get that influence quicker, and yet I can still maintain a certain level of self-control. You know, not that we're all in control. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because control can have a negative context, just like any other word. If it goes too far, if I have to think that I'm God and I maintain ultimate control, then I'm going too far.
When I rip the reins away and say, "These are mine." Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's really all good stuff. That it makes me think of something that's been really front of mind, and actually, that's a pun for about what I'm about to say. But like, I've been talking about this recently a lot, specifically in regards to some conversations with some friends I have. You know, I work with sexual addiction a lot, right? And that's something in my background. So I work with others to try and work through that. And there's this one concept that we call bouncing eyes.
Okay.
And it's this idea that, you know, instead of keep fixating on a woman as she walks through the door, maybe she's, you know, scantily clad or whatever, instead of fixating on that, like bounce, you know,
sure.
I notice, I move on, right?
Yep.
But the big kind of the premise behind that, from my perspective, is bringing something from the subconscious up into the consciousness.
Agreed.
So it's kind of taking it from the primary function of, ooh, sex, need it, you know, into this frontal cortex area where I go, yeah, but that's a woman. I respect her. I don't, you know, she's not mine to have.
Yep. She's not a possession.
Yeah, exactly. She's not even an object. She's a human being. She has she has parents. She might have kids, you know, like just bringing it up into the consciousness instead of leaving it. And I feel like so much of addiction and problematic behavior is because it's left in the subconscious. So a lot of the work of recovery is like, let's bump it up into the consciousness. So let's be focused on this thing instead of not thinking about this thing. And that's why there's so much repetitive behavior in recovery, and you know, consistent environments, consistent people, places, things that you do is to keep this thing up in the frontal cortex instead of letting it fall back to primary functions of like, that thing solves my needs, I need more, you know. And I don't know, just for some reason that's come up in conversations like several times in the past couple of weeks that made me think of that. But this idea of like separating it, you know, bring it up out of the subconscious to be able to actually operate on it.
Yep.
To be able to think about it, roll it around in your hand. Like I'm holding my hands in front of me, right? This is the idea in front of me. I can look at it, I can turn it, I can move it, I can do what I need to do with it.
Yep.
Instead of just letting it control me subconsciously. And I feel like that's a lot of what these gateways allow you to do, is like take this thing from that primary side of just fight or flight, subconscious, and bring it up into the consciousness where you can hold it in your hand, roll it around, look at it, in some ways in a short-circuited fashion where, you know, holding that thing in your hand might, you might be like, I can't do that, it's going to burn my hands or whatever. It's just like this like fear, or you can kind of jump into that in a expedited form, whether it's through chemical or hypnosis or whatever, to where you're able to operate with it safely. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because I'll what you're talking about in the subconscious, you know, I'll typically identify those as files. In other words, we have a multitude of files in our subconscious that we typically, when someone asks us a question or we're posed with a conflict, we typically, it's about 8 seconds. The average is about 8 seconds. Most decisions, we have about 7 to 10 seconds to be able to formalize a decision. And so often our tendency is to not even bring it so much to the conscious.
Right.
We leave it we just make that decision based on those prior files of family, sex, you know, whatever, you know, we need to combine. I pull it out of those files to be able to make that decision. And it's just funny because, you know, when you think about 8 seconds, 8 seconds can be a long time if you're riding a bull. You know, but it can be an instant if you're trying to, you know, if you're just following a habit. You know. So I like that, what you're saying.
8 seconds is the upper limit, right? So probably most things we pull from the cache and we move on. And
oh yeah, that's what I'm
instant,
saying. But
right.
we still have 7 to 10 seconds, give or take, 8 seconds to make a different decision in that process. When we have that in order to bring it from the subconscious to the conscious, we still have like on TV, we have that 8-second delay or whatever to be able to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And that's just a conscious decision, and being able to make that in such a way that gives me a level of self-control can make all the difference.
So if I reframe what you're saying or try and understand a little bit more, essentially, if I struggle with a compulsive behavior, maybe one particular tool to use is say, whenever you have a compulsion to do that thing, think about it for 8 seconds.
Yep.
Or 10.
Yep.
Go for 10.
Just
Think
before
about
I
it
do
for
that.
10 seconds. And if you still got to have that cookie, well, whatever. But if you can, every single time you have a compulsion, you give it that 10-second focused thought.
Right.
Do I need it? Can I wait? Can I wait, 20 minutes? Go through 10 seconds is a long time to think about all the things. And at the end, if you're like, no, I got to have it, well, help yourself. But if you can get, if in the course of that, I feel like it's a good tool. Is that kind of...
Yeah, no doubt. And then I think too, in this process, not getting frustrated with ourselves.
Yeah.
I think, well, I shouldn't have done that. I'm terrible. I shouldn't, that thought came to my mind. Here again,
we need to do an episode on shame.
Yeah.
Versus, have we done?
I think we have. It seems like we have. Sometimes it seems.
85th episode this week. So at this point, you gotta understand, it's hard to remember them all.
But at the same time, I'm thinking about it in that context of, how things come to my mind, and I have the ability to process it. I have to have the ability to take my thoughts captive, self-control, those kind of things when I'm able to engage that. And that's where, in some ways, I don't have an issue, with a physical exercise of like yoga.
Yeah.
Because I think it's another form of being able to exercise a level of self-control, that what I wasn't able to do, I didn't have this flexibility before, now I've basically worked on it, and now I have this ability. And that's just from my perspective, a healthy form of self-control.
Yeah.
And when I can exercise that, then I'm able to apply that to other areas of my life as well.
Yeah. It's like learning how to, it's like a safe way to learn how to reprogram, right?
Yeah. Because I'm being able to recognize that even though in that circumstance, like when you mentioned the woman, who's, experienced sexual abuse, that kind of thing, it's a matter of that relearning, that I may not have had control in that situation, full control. may not have had 100%, but I had certain controls.
Yeah.
And I'm able to see that better.
Yeah.
And I'm able to recognize that in life, I still have certain controls, and I'm working to, increase those controls.
Yeah.
That are available to me.
Yeah. We just recently had an episode on the Serenity Prayer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's while you're talking about control, the other half of this equation is where we don't, and learning the difference. And I feel like that's where we get stuck, because it is important to know when you don't have control.
Yep.
Right.
And there's something to be said for accepting that as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So we don't have to re-tease the Serenity Prayer, but I do think that's as much as we talk about needing to learn control over those behaviors, it's also important to understand what you don't have control over. You don't have control over someone else's behavior, for instance. And so, that's where codependence needs some reprogramming to be able to say, no, I can't make that person do what I want to make them do.
Right.
No matter what my behavior is, even if I get them to do what I'm trying to make them do, it's going to be based on my efforts, not their own, And so understanding the difference between what I have control over and what I don't is a pretty important skill to have. But
as I was thinking about what you were saying too, I think, that scripture about, everything's permissible.
You're playing my guitar.
I'm playing your guitar by turning your chair. Nah, it's like, where did that tone come from?
I don't know if you'll hear that, but if you do, you'll understand.
Yeah. But in that process of, everything acceptable, how's that go?
Yeah, everything is permissible, but not everything is
beneficial.
Yeah.
And I think about that. I would extend that to all of our listeners who may disagree on the topic of hypnosis. Mm-hmm. If it's not something, I'm not saying everybody needs to do it by mm-hmm. any means, but if it's something that you feel is wrong, that's okay.
Yeah.
And for you, it is wrong at that point.
Yeah.
I think that's part of how I see it, and being able to recognize, okay, as I learn though, that there are differences between, what I've experienced or what I think, there's something to be said for that awareness that says, okay, yeah, this has less conflict in my mind. Not that I'm accepting all things, but I'm willing to filter in such a way that says, okay, God, I can talk with you about this subject. And, anything that I can talk with God about is healthy from my perspective.
That's right. Right.
That awareness.
There's no subject off limits with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Because if there is something that I can't talk with God about, it's probably not beneficial.
Right. James 4:17 says, remember to sin to know what you ought to do and then not to do it. And vice versa, to know you shouldn't do something and then to do it. So I think that applies here in the sense we're not encouraging anyone to do something that they don't believe is right, but it's definitely an opportunity to kind of think about these things from a maybe a more healthy perspective instead of the traditional stage mm-hmm. version, to be able to think about it from a, potentially offering help to people who need help.
Yeah. Nope. That's I guess what we desire to do.
That's right.
Is offer the ability to offer help in such a way that says, hey, this is something we're aware of, and we might as well talk about it because it can seem to be polarizing at times.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because that's how we see it.
That's how we see it.
Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like How I See It, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.